Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Hong Kong Horror. Simon here. So tonight, I want to share a story with you all from a viewer from Malaysia. She asked me to keep her name private, so let's just call her Bonnie. Bonnie and her husband were house hunting one day when something strange happened. As always, please stick around till after the story as I break everything down from a Chinese cultural perspective. So let's turn on the lights, get comfortable, and let's dive right into this one. This story takes place in Malaysia, where Bonnie calls home. Now, Bonnie is someone who feels things deeply. She doesn't usually talk about it openly, but she's always had this sensitivity. She'll pick up on energies and presences, and it's not something that she could just switch on or off, as it's something she's had most of her life. Most of the time, she only realizes when something's happening when she's already in the thick of it, or right after the feeling hits her like a physical blow. Over the years, she's had energies and presences follow her through different phases of her life. The experience she wanted to share with us tonight is a bit more recent. A few years ago, Bonnie and her husband were out house hunting. If you've ever done this, then you know how exhausting it can get. By the time the story happens, they had already been to so many places that the layouts and neighborhoods were all starting to blur together. The only thing she could remember about those homes is that none of them felt like a real home. Then, one day, they found a listing that stood out. It was tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, right next to a little park, and walking distance to her children's school. The area was completely shaded by tall, mature trees. It was actually really peaceful, almost rare for an area so close to the town center. From the outside, the house was definitely older, but Bonnie had always been drawn to older properties. They have character. But before she even stepped foot inside, something about this place was calling out to her. When Bonnie and her husband arrived, the property agent and the owner were already waiting outside. The doors and windows were all wide open, as if airing the place out for the viewing. After exchanging pleasantries, Bonnie decided she wanted to walk the exterior perimeter of the property before going inside. As she was walking past one of the open ground floor windows, there was some movement that caught her eye. She glanced inside and saw an old woman sitting in a chair quietly in the living room. She looked peaceful, like she was just resting or maybe watching TV or something. Bonnie honestly didn't think twice about it. This was an older neighborhood. Lots of elderly residents lived around here, and she just assumed it was the owner's mother. She didn't want to be rude and stare, so she continued her lap into the backyard. When she got there, she noticed that the garden was completely overgrown. The exterior walls of the house also showed obvious signs of neglect. It didn't look completely abandoned, but it certainly didn't look cared for. Again, Bonnie rationalized it. Maybe the elderly owners just couldn't keep up with the maintenance anymore. Maybe that's why their son was selling it. Standing in the overgrown grass, listening to the birds from the park next door, Bonnie could easily picture her family living here. Quiet mornings, slow evenings. It just felt right. After a few minutes of soaking it all in, she circled back to the front to finally take a look inside. Now, in Asian households, taking off your shoes at the door is basically an unspoken rule. It's a sign of respect. Bonnie was the first one to the entrance, so she immediately bent over to unlace her shoes. But the owner stopped her. He gave her a polite smile and said, "Oh, please, don't worry about that. Just walk in with your shoes. This house has been unoccupied for a long time. It's really dusty. I don't want you to ruin your socks." Bonnie froze. Empty? For a long time? Just 2 minutes ago, she had clearly seen an old woman sitting in the living room. She didn't say a word. She just nodded in silence, kept her shoes on, and stepped inside. The house wasn't empty. It was fully furnished, but walking into it felt like stepping into a time capsule permanently stuck in the 1990s. The furniture looked untouched. Old family photos hung perfectly straight on the walls. The beds were made Clothes were still folded away. It didn't feel like a house that was packed up to be sold. It felt like someone had walked out the door one afternoon and simply never came back. As Bonnie walked deeper into the hallway, the atmosphere shifted. Suddenly, she was hit with a crushing wave of sadness. It wasn't a slow build. It slammed into her all at once. It was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on her chest. Her eyes started to sting. She felt like she was going to collapse and just start sobbing right there on the dusty floorboards. The most terrifying part? She knew these weren't her emotions. It felt entirely external, like someone else's absolute despair had dropped onto her shoulders. She had unknowingly walked into a space where this grief already existed, and she was absorbing it like a sponge. The feeling kept rising, completely out of her control. Desperate, she turned to her husband, blamed the dust, and said that she needed some air. She powered walked back to the front door, but as she passed the living room, she glanced at the wall. Hanging there was an old family portrait, and staring back at her from that frame was the same exact old woman she had seen sitting in that chair. And because in our culture, you're taught to be highly respectful in places that held history, Bonnie lowered her head. Very softly, she whispered into the empty room. She apologized. She said she meant no disrespect. She was only there to view the home and that she wasn't there to disturb anyone. She walked straight out to the park next door, entirely removing herself from the property line. But the heaviness didn't leave. It clung to her. A few minutes later, the agent came out to join her while her husband finished the tour. Bonnie started asking questions. What's the history here? Did something happen? The agent gave the standard official answer. No, nothing tragic. The owners passed away naturally, and the son, who was in his 60s now, was simply letting the old family home go. But then, the agent let something slip. The house had almost sold twice before. Both times, they had buyers at the finish line, and both times, the deal mysteriously fell through. In one instance, a man was buying the house for his aging mother, specifically because it was a single story. But right as the loans were being processed, his mother unexpectedly passed away. The deal died with her. Bonnie looked at the agent and said, without even thinking, and blurted out, "You need to tell the family to do prayers in that house. Do a blessing, a cleanse, honor the previous owners so they can clear the space." When her husband finally emerged from the house, Bonnie grabbed his arm. She whispered, "Apologize to the house right now, and let's leave." Knowing his wife's sensitivities, he didn't ask any questions. He simply thanked the owner, and they left. On the car ride home, the emotional weight finally started to lift. Though it took hours of resting in her own bed to fully ground herself again. Bonnie realized that the old woman she saw had never really moved on. Her grief was so profound, so deeply anchored to that property that the sorrow was literally living in the walls. It had been 5 years now since that viewing. To this day, that house still sits empty. Bonnie and her family eventually found their forever home. The moment they stepped inside that one, it felt bright, open, and naturally peaceful. She made an offer before the tour was even over. The contrast between the two places taught her a very valuable lesson. Not every place that feels like home is meant for you, and not every feeling you carry is your own. So, Hong Kong horror family, what do you think happened here in Bonnie's story? Bonnie will be watching this, so please pause the video here and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Alright, so what do I think happened here from a Chinese cultural perspective? Whenever a house is left unoccupied for such a long period of time, something happens. It stops generating yang energy, yang hei, which is the positive energy of the living. All of us give off this energy when we are alive. Now, places that are abandoned or empty for a long period of time due to a lack of yang energy now become an area that accumulates yin energy, yamhei, which is the total opposite of yang energy. Yin energy is negative energy, and on the opposite end of the spectrum, it's associated with coldness, darkness, and death. Spirits are considered yin beings, as they belong to the world of the dead, and environments that are yin-heavy become incredibly hospitable to spirits. In my opinion, what Bonnie experienced here at this house wasn't a malicious haunting. What she saw was something closer to a spiritual residue. In my culture, there's a difference between a malevolent spirit and a lingering spirit. There's a term we use called yumling, which means a spirit that remains with the human world. But not every yumling is dangerous. A big majority of them are simply just people who've passed away, but never fully detached from places or routines that have defined a huge chunk of their lives. If you recall from some of my past episodes, death is not seen as an immediate departure from this world. It's seen as more of a process where our soul is believed to gradually separate from this world after we're gone. We have a term called Samwan Sapat, which translates to 3 souls and 7 spirits, meaning that our soul isn't one large unified piece. Rather, it's separated into smaller pieces. And the belief is that not all pieces of the soul leave at the same time after death. This is actually a pretty complex concept, but I can expand on this. So, what exactly is Samwan Sapat? This is an extremely ancient concept that predates many of the modern Chinese ghost beliefs. Human beings are not thought to have a single, indivisible soul. Instead, we have Samwan, the 3 Hun souls, and Sapak, 7 Po spirits. The general idea is that the Samwan is associated with our consciousness, personality, spiritual awareness, and higher functions, while the Sapak, 7 Po spirits, are associated with things such as instincts, emotions, physical attachment, and bodily existence. So in super simple terms, the One is what makes you, you, and the Pak is what keeps you connected to earthly self. When a person dies, these components do not all leave at the same time, but instead it happens separately and gradually. If you've ever witnessed a Chinese funeral, this is why there are multiple rituals that occur over several days and weeks. The family is helping guide the soul of their lost loved one through a transition process. So, what does this have to do with Bonnie's experience? So, in my personal opinion, I would say that this old woman that she saw in the house was indeed present, but I do not believe all of her was there. It was only part of her. Do you know what I mean by this? This goes back to the concept of Samwan Sapak. Most likely, parts of this woman's soul are no longer in that house anymore. One portion of her soul may have already reached the underworld. Another part may have joined her ancestors. But there was one part that lingered in that home. Chances are, this old woman that Bonnie saw is not fully conscious, because most of her Samwan Sapak have already transitioned to the next phase of existence. What was left at that house was just a fragment of her full self, a part that was tied to a memory and attachment, a lingering Pak still attached to that house. There could be many reasons why a part of this old woman's Pak remained. Maybe she was missing her family, or she was worried about her son. But from what we know, based on what Bonnie shared with us, there doesn't seem to be any hatred. Bonnie felt overwhelming feelings of sadness, which leads me to think that part of this old woman's Pak remained due to her missing her family, or something along those lines. So, it can actually get a lot deeper than this. I know it's a bit confusing enough already, right? It's believed that reincarnation is fully associated with the first part of Samwan Sapak. So as long as the One moves on, then the person can move on to reincarnation eventually, even if parts of the Pak remains here on Earth, like this old woman's. This is because the One is again associated with our consciousness and identity. So as long as those parts move on, it will be okay. The Pak is related to earthly attachment and physical life, and it's believed that these will eventually gradually disperse on its own. So some of you might be worried about this old woman, not being able to move on since a part of her soul is still there, but I don't think we have to worry about that. I believe the essential souls have already moved on, but there are just some earthly attachment remains left behind. Okay, so let me try to explain this in a way that's much easier to grasp. Imagine a candle that's lit. When the flame is extinguished, what happens? The flame is gone, but that's not the end, right? Usually, once this flame is gone, smoke appears, which will linger in the room for a bit. The wax from the candle also remains on the table it's on. All of these things come from the same candle, but they don't travel together. Think of death in the same way. When a person dies, even if the essential spiritual consciousness has moved on, there sometimes can still be traces that have been left behind. Many times, it's these remaining traces that people experience in paranormal encounters. Over time, the old woman's POC should eventually weaken. As time passes, attachment weakens, and the emotional residue will fade. I think what Bonnie saw was a remnant that would eventually fully fade away on its own, as it slowly loses the emotional force keeping it together. Now, of course, there are cases where the attachment is extremely strong, but that's something else entirely, as then it would be a situation of sapnim, which translates to a fixation so powerful that it continues after death. That's a whole different ballpark, which doesn't relate to the situation, so I won't discuss that now. So now, I want to go back to something that Bonnie described. She felt this overpowering emotion of sadness that wasn't her own. Seeing a spirit is rare, but feeling one is much more common in comparison. Emotional perception is often the first way a person encounters the spiritual world. Some people, like Bonnie, naturally possess stronger sensitivity to the spirit world than others. This is something we call lingam. Everyone has different sensitivities, but this doesn't mean that everyone with a high lingam will be able to see ghosts walking around every day. More commonly, they might experience things like dreaming about dead people, sensing someone watching them who aren't really there, or becoming emotionally affected by a location. Bonnie seems to have a fairly strong lingam, since she was able to see the old woman as well. Now, why did Bonnie feel this powerful emotion of sadness? Well, do you remember when I explained what POC, soul, is made up of? In case you forgot, I'll repeat it again. POC, the 7 pole spirits, are associated with things such as instincts, emotions, physical attachment, and bodily existence. This is why I mentioned that I think the old woman's soul that remained in that house is not a 1, but a POC, because emotions are precisely what the POC is associated with. What Bonnie experienced was the emotional state attached to the lingering POC of that old woman due to her high sensitivity. Thank you, Hong Kong Horror family, for making it all the way to the end of this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed tonight's story. I also wanted to thank Bonnie for sharing her story with us. I hope you enjoyed my personal breakdown of what I think happened. And if any of you have any stories of your own that you want to send to me, I would be happy to take a look at it and try to break it down for you from a Chinese cultural perspective. But please, make sure to include every detail you remember. Alright, stay safe everyone, and good night. We'll speak again next week.